There we go. Are we honestly, I mean, in all seriousness, are we doing the internet thing of first, second, and third? Is that what's happening here in the chat right now? I mean, I'm not really objecting. I'm just more kind of curious as to when did that happen? We would never. Of course not. Of course not. Absolutely not. No, not whatsoever. No, you're just here because you have a vested interest in dominating the rest of the internet by being here and speaking before anyone else does, because that's the key. That's where we want to be with our lives. I get it. I understand. And all in all, it makes a lot of sense to me, right? I mean, that's kind of what's up. You flex where you can. Well, depends on whether you have anything worth to flex for. Weirdness, fourth is the best, though. I mean, let's be honest. And of course, I'm also looking and I see that you have a first next to your handle in Twitch chat. Hey, Dio. That's 20 months at 3. Damn. Damn, Dio, damn. So Weirdness and Dio get to flex on everybody because they also have the first badge for this channel, which means that they were among the first 10 to subscribe. And we also, I mean, you flex where you can. Because we originally were streaming on another channel. RPGClinic actually started on my channel, my personal Twitch channel. And it was originally supposed to be this show. It was just this show. RPGClinic was the show that was essentially, okay, so we'll talk about role-playing. And then it just sort of grew and morphed. And then we, at one point, were, we'd been streaming on my channel for quite some time. And I wasn't super comfortable with it because I didn't want the credit when it was all four of us. I know that, like, I'm not trying to humble brag here. Just quite literally, it was like, my channel is branded with my name. And it seems weird that we're forcing people to look for me when what they're really looking for is us. So we moved over to RPGClinic, but that did mean that there were more people who had the opportunity to become the first subscribers, and Dio and Weirdness were there. They were there. So they get to be cool. They get to be firsts. But it doesn't mean that I'm not going to say hi to the rest of you for being here first, because obviously I like people being here. Kaiser Omnic also dropping in at first. All the firsts coming in just happen to have their subscriptions coming up, which means that, of course, now a hype train has started, which is awesome. You can be cool, Requiem. Everybody's cool who's here. That isn't in question. It's just I find it amusing that there was a first, second, third things, and then the firsts for this channel started showing up. That's kind of the amusing part for me. I'll be honest. I was sitting on my couch in my living room, wondering what the hell I was going to talk about up until 15 minutes before stream started, and then I reached out to a couple of people for ideas. One-shots were brought up, but then I fell upon min-maxing. And I'm not sure if I've done a whole lot of talking about min-maxing on this channel before, because I think I have done one-shots at one point. But if we run out of things to talk about, we can always swap over to one-shots. But I kind of wanted to talk about min-maxing because I think that it's a much more complicated subject than I originally thought of. So what we're going to do, we're going to define what min-maxing is. We're going to take a look at what it means for games when you have either one min-maxer or many, or whether you have a storyteller who is a min-maxer, why this can be a great thing for your game, and why it can absolutely mess stuff up. So the really the first thing, and I'm going to be repeating this a whole bunch today just because I want to make sure that people know that this is how I feel about min-maxing. And because obviously, you know, there's only a certain number of people who are here at the beginning. So there is that to take into account. Min-maxing in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a good thing. And if you suspect that you or someone you love is a min-maxer, I am not saying that you are either a bad person or a bad role player. So I want to make sure that that's 100% crystal clear, because we're very close to a hype train, but it's 38 seconds until it ends. So I have a feeling like that's going to pass us by. Because min-maxing isn't necessarily easily defined. Weirdness, dropping 100 bits in all weirdness gets the hype train started. That's so kind. That's very kind. I really do appreciate it. So what we're going to do is first, let's define what min-maxing is, because there's min-maxing and then there's also twinking, which are two different things. Honk indeed. In the name of min-maxing hype train. Thank you very much. That is very appreciated. So I'll point out right away that I actually personally believe that there is a difference between min-maxing and twinking. So let's go into how we can define these terms, and then we can get on to a proper discussion about what it means when you're doing these sorts of things. So min-maxing, if you look on giantbomb.com, they have a whole page on this. They define min-maxing as the concept of minimizing undesirable qualities of a character so as to maximize desirable qualities in order to achieve the most powerful character possible in a role-playing game. Min-maxing is the character building strategy of maximizing a specific desirable ability, skill, or other power of a character and minimizing everything else, seen as undesirable. The result is a character who is excessively powerful in one particular way, but exceedingly weak in others. So that's one. And hey, 36, welcome in. And that's level 2 complete for the hype train. That's awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I should check to see if I qualify. Do I qualify? See, the weird thing is that because I don't often visit this channel with my own account, it is indeed. So I can actually take advantage of this hype train by subscribing to my own damn channel. Our channel. But at any rate, so min-maxing, if we look at min-maxing as this, it's just, I am going to specifically select for what I want on my character sheet to be as powerful as it can get. And in order to do so, because most character creation systems force you to choose and balance out. Hey, thanks, Anonymous, for gifting a sub to Reading Aloud. It's very kind of you. I mean, to an extent, min-maxing is something that most games actually promote. The idea is that your character has some specialties, has some things that they are good at compared to things that they are less good at. You'll see this reflected in character classes. You'll see this reflected in point-buy systems where you are forced to prioritize. Sometimes, for instance, in the storyteller system, you have to prioritize physical, mental, and social traits, or separate kinds of abilities. In D&D, some classes will basically say, well, you are definitely good at hitting things with a sword. You are not so good at remembering arcane mysteries. There are any number of ways in which your character sheet is balanced in this way. Min-maxing, however, is when you hamper or even take penalties in order to boost your abilities up to the highest that you possibly can. You'll also see this happen in computer games, where your character can be customized, where you'll say like, well, I will never, ever try to talk my way out of everything. So I'm going to make sure that my charisma is a dump stat. Dump stats, of course, being the, I'm going to make this as low as possible because I do not care about it. Is never covering a weakness min-maxing. So the thing is that we've defined min-maxing. And now I'm going to define twinking. And I think that might make a difference as to what we're looking at here. Because you could say that min-maxing would apply if you were also trying to deliberately create a weakness for your character as an interesting role-playing opportunity. Such as Ellie Spot getting in on this hype train. Thank you. So here is an example. If I wanted to create a character and I wanted this character to be somebody who was a dashing hero but really struggled with struggled with their stamina. Like they were sickly growing up and they wanted to be a hero despite the fact that they were not necessarily in the greatest of health. You could call that min-maxing because I'm deliberately keeping my stamina low because I'm minimizing that, and those points have to go somewhere else afterwards. But let's have a look at what twinking is. Twinking is actually defined in Wikipedia, which is kind of fascinating to me. The concept that there's a whole thing for this. It starts off with saying not to be confused with twink, which is gay slang. The etymology, some people believe that it is actually derived from the gay slang usage of twink. One of the connotations of this usage is a young or inexperienced person who can outfit himself fashionably because of financial benefits from an older or experienced sugar daddy. But it's not certain what the origin is. And at this point, it is now sort of taken away a bit from, like, the calling somebody a twink or twinking is not, as far as I can tell, still linked to that. Now, if somebody realizes that, whoa, okay, that's great, foot for everybody, get that choo-choo in there. If, however, it is still linked to LGBT slang, then that's the thing is that it doesn't seem to be linked to a slur. It is linked to slang that was used in the LGBT community. So I still use the term. However, I'm also completely aware that of its potential origins. And of course, if it ends up being an issue, then I'll cease. But here's what twinking is. Twinking is a type of behavior in role-playing games which involves deceiving other players about one's playing abilities or achievements in the game. A player who engages in such behavior is known as a twink. But that's for video games. In pen and paper games, it is known as twinking is often synonymous with a munchkin, a power gamer who seeks to acquire power and loot at the expense of their teammates. So I've kind of encountered this in a lot of different ways, but the way that I would say that I'm defining it for the purpose of today's discussion, is somebody who is min-maxing on their sheet in a way that is detrimental to the game. Toot toot is the show the cheer emote in Swedish for you. I mean, it's Swedish for you. I know that when Kung Fu Fenris is part of a hype train, he gets foot. So I think it just is based on the language that you normally interact with Twitch, and then it tells you. Choo choo is the English version of toot toot or foot. So I just find it fascinating how it changes from around the world. So the power gamer is one of the player types. And as one of the player types goes, again, this is mostly based on where does somebody get their emotional kick? Why do they play in a role-playing game? What is it about role-playing that gets them going and that gets them excited? And people are more complicated than just being able to categorize them into one type. But there are definitely players out there who absolutely take as part of what they really enjoy about a game, taking the mechanics of the game and trying as best they can to use them to their advantage. In a way, you're trying to beat the game through mechanics. This is different from a tactician who's trying to beat the game through outwitting the storyteller. It's a power gamer is trying to look at the mechanics of the game, figure out where they can optimize the best or the most, and then through that, be able to succeed in the challenges that they find the most interesting. And that's not in and of itself an evil thing or a bad thing. And a lot of people do it. I will be the first to admit that when I play D&D, I often tinker a bunch with the mechanics, mostly because in realizing that D&D doesn't give me a whole lot of options when it comes to customizing the way that my character feels to play. Instead, then I focus on, well, okay, how can I get the mechanics to do what I want at this point in time? Especially also because D&D is not a point-buy system. So in minimizing or maximizing that character, what you're really trying to do is basically make the most efficient choices for your campaign. But in a point-buy system, like in the storyteller system, where you have a starting character where you're filling in dots where you choose, and when you spend experience as opposed to leveling up, you spend experience to increase stats that you want. Being weak in your role feels bad in D&D. Kaiser Omnic, you are absolutely correct in that one. And I think that one of the main reasons for it feeling that way, is because D&D as a game is very much revolving around its math. And if you have unoptimized your character, the math stops working for you and you start struggling unless your DM can adjust encounters to make sure that you still feel like you're effective. At the same time, the other players in your group aren't necessarily effective either. Hey, Kung Fu Fenris. I really, this is one of the things that I would do about D&D. What feats do I pick? Do I multi-class or not? Is there a build that I'm going for? And these are natural inclinations for a certain percentage of players to take. And in this particular case, in a game like D&D, the game is balanced around the idea that players are attempting to make the best decisions for themselves. There are definitely options in D&D that are better than others if you want to be effective. Especially because in their character creation, there are things like, what background do you choose? Your background gets you a couple of extra trained skills that you wouldn't normally have in your class. And there are certain skills that are way more important than others. Perception as a skill will always be, in D&D, one of the most important skills to have for at least one person in your party. Depending on your DM, possibly everyone in your party. And there are certain backgrounds that will give you perception as a skill. Yeah, especially in D&D 3rd with its many trap options. Exactly, right? But you'll also just be like, are you ambushed? No. Do you discover the clue to the puzzle? No, because you didn't invest in perception. It is one of the reasons that if I were creating my own system at one point, I'd probably avoid having perception as a stat, because I don't like, and I flip-flop on this. I still haven't quite figured it out. But the issue that I have, I guess, with perception is that it's such a no-brainer to want to be able to notice as much as you can. In too many games, perception is just such an incredibly overpowered, overloaded stat that I wouldn't want to rely on it. But at any rate, most people have yeeted it. Yeah, it is true. But L5R yeeted it to a certain degree. Yeah. You don't want players to min-max just to find the plot. That's the other thing, right? Like if I want you to find a clue, I want you to find a clue. I don't want you to have to roll for it. And then if you miss it, then I guess I have to give it to you anyway. Like perception often ends up being a binary, do you progress or not? And those aren't typically great for stories. Winning or losing a battle, that isn't necessarily binary. Losing a battle can still progress the story in very interesting ways, but not noticing a clue, especially with inexperienced storytellers, that just shuts everything down at any rate. Avatar of Cain says, it's why, even though I'm not a solid fan overall, I like Pathfinder 2's approach of perception as still being a skill, but being a universal adventure skill. Yeah, I do like how some certain systems will just say that perception isn't a stat and instead you roll a relevant skill. So if you're trying to find say a gun, you would have to roll your gun skill. If you're trying to find cracks in the walls, then that would be your craft skill, because that's a little bit better, but it's still, to me, difficult because noticing a gun doesn't necessarily have much to do with how much I've trained in firearms. Some of it is just like, how perceptive am I in the universe? And then you get back to having a perceptive skill. Either way. In a point-buy system, min-maxing starts getting a little more dangerous. And the reason why is that in point-buy systems, these are games that are often not necessarily focused on combat. D&D as a game is focused on combat. No matter how you choose to play it, the rules are slanted in favor of combat. And if you need proof of that, look at D&D source books, and the Monster Compendium, sure, it has information about monsters, but most of the text is about how those monsters fight. If you look at the player's guide, most of the information in that book ends up becoming how to create a character and then how does that character get involved in combat. I've spent 1,000 hours at the shooting range. I can now recognize the shape of a gun. I can understand how it might help you a little bit because you might recognize things that other people won't. I definitely think that it makes a difference if you're trying to identify individual features of a firearm that you've discovered. Anyway. But in a point-buy system, point-buy games, oftentimes there are multiple ways to approach problems, and the systems are designed to support that. Whether you want to go a social route, or a combat route, or an intrigue route, or a thinking puzzle route, you can do a lot of these things. And at least, but now I'm just wondering whether you actually have spent 1,000 hours at a shooting range, because if so, good on you. Your class doesn't have the gunsmithing skill trained? Too bad. Yeah, absolutely. Which is part of the reason why I like point-buy systems, because I personally, and I think that a lot of people really like classes, and that's great. I personally love being able to move in the direction that I'm feeling at any one point in time. I like when my character feels like, well, recently I've been working on my social skills, so I can increase those. And then later on be like, I feel like my character has been put against the wall a lot, so I'm going to increase combat skills. So that kind of helps, right? Now, but because there are multiple ways in which to approach a problem, if you min-max, what you're essentially signaling to a storyteller at that point is, this is how I want to play the game. There are exceptions. If you have a lot of method players sometimes will give themselves weaknesses and want to be challenged on those weaknesses quite a bit, because they want to experience the struggle, the strife of not being good at something. You'll also find this in people who are really heavy into role-playing specifically, even if it's not necessarily in relation to their character. My players on Sundays often will build in weaknesses to their characters because they find it interesting. And that is a form of min-maxing. They want a weakness, so they engineer their stats to have a weakness. And then, but in a lot of ways, when somebody hands you a sheet and you can see that they've very heavily invested in stats that involve a certain activity, what that player is telling you on that character sheet is, I want to be able to do this activity and be good at it. But what if that's not the game that you were hoping to run? Or even if it was the kind of game that you were hoping to run, how do you balance the idea that you have one person who has decided that they want to be an expert in something compared to others who may not have made that choice themselves? Because then it gets hard. If you have somebody who's very heavily invested in social skills, then the temptation becomes, why do I have a, that's nothing. The temptation becomes, every time that we're involved in a social situation, let's shove the social character to the front of the line and they'll do the interactions. They'll do the talking because they're the best at it. And the rest of us will shut our yaps because we aren't. Then when the puzzle shows up, you shove the person who's min-maxed their way to being smart and good with puzzles and good with research and say, you're the one who will figure out the puzzles. The rest of us will hang back. And then when it comes to combat, you shove the person who's decided to deck themselves out in all the best weapons and armor and skills and say, it's up to you now. You'll do the fighting for us and the rest of us will hang back. And that's often a dangerous thing. By the way, if you start your post with an exclamation mark and a Q and then a space, if it's a question, it'll automatically put itself into my queue system so that I can bring it up. There you go. Loom of Fate just popped in with that. So just in case I miss your post, that's a way to make sure that it gets added to the queue so that I can see it and put it up on the screen. And this can be discouraging because it means that in any one type of activity that you're throwing at your players, somebody has their chance to shine, which you want, but everyone else has decided that they're not going to participate because it's not worth it, which is something that you don't. And this is especially dangerous when it comes to combat. If you have one person who's excellent in combat and everyone else has chosen not to be, combat is the sort of thing that can affect everyone. But it means that if you bring somebody who's a big bad in, and you have somebody who's excellent at combat and everyone else isn't, well, either this person has to be weakened so that they don't one-shot the players who are no good at combat, in which case, not much of a fight for the combat monster in your game, or this person has to give the combat monster a challenge, which means that they will destroy anyone else in the game, depending on the system, obviously. And that's a huge problem, potentially, for you in a game like this, because depending on the kind of game that you're trying to run, you may find that then you're reluctant to bring in elements that favor one or two players over all the other players, or characters, I suppose I should say at this point. Let's see here. So therein lies an issue. Kaiser Omnic asks, is min-maxing a necessary evil of skill-based games? I think that there's a difference between specializing and min-maxing. And I think that min-maxing can provide an interesting challenge for a player, but a lot of min-maxers ignore something. And this is the thing, if there's something that I can get out there for players today, it would be this. If you min-max, you have to be signing up for the mins as well as the maxes, and they both have to be interesting for you. Because if they're not, you're essentially strong-arming the rest of the game to do what you want. And that's not necessarily fair. If everybody has chosen to min-max in a certain way, and your storyteller has decided that that's the game you want to play, and they're just going to play a really high-level game like that, go for it. But if you've decided that you're going to be the absolute best at cooking, and in exchange, you will be absolutely miserable at talking to anybody at any one point in time because your social stats are so low, well, then you better hope that you enjoy elements of cooking in your role-playing games, but also elements in you making an absolute ass of yourself because you aren't being charismatic. If you don't if you can't balance both of those things, then what you've done is essentially said, I only ever want to cook. That's all I want to do. However, spotlighting is important. Spotlighting is important because otherwise, if everybody just is the same, I'm kind of good at everything, but I'm not excellent in anything, and I'm not abysmal in anything, then you don't really stand out. When it comes to drama is often about extremes, and drama is something that you want in all your games, even if it's a comedy game, even if it's a game where you're not really role-playing, you're just rolling out combats. Drama is the thing that gets people excited and interesting. It's the conflict. And if you are just kind of good at everything, that doesn't promote conflict. Extremes promote conflict. But extremes can provoke the wrong kinds of conflict in your game. If you have a player who is like, but I invested all of this social stats, and all we ever do is fight, and I suck at fighting. Every time my character picks up a sword, they get absolutely hosed. Why don't we ever talk to anybody? And you're like, that wasn't the game that we were going to play. We're doing a dungeon crawl. The point of a dungeon crawl is that you're going to hit things to make them fall down. You can't even speak the language of most of the things in this dungeon because they're either mindless automatons or they're dragons and they don't speak common or whatever. And you're like, but that's not the character I made. So that's one of the things that's worth kind of paying attention to work out in that way. Reading Aloud asks, if you have a group with uniform min-maxing like similar weaknesses, how would a DM add encounters that avoid a TPK? You don't. Unless you vastly underlevel those encounters right off the bat. Or you specifically have it so that when the player characters look like they're about to lose, something happens that rescues them. Either they accept a surrender, NPCs show up to help the battle, Deus Ex Machina, rocks fall, and they happen to die. But if your party has all uniformly min-maxed, they're telling you the kind of game they want to play. And you should ask them, out of character, straight up, hey, what about these things that you would be weak against? Have you thought of that? How would you feel if these things came up to you? And I know that a lot of players will be like, oh, it's fine. And then when you do that, they get frustrated and they hate it. So it's kind of a balance here that you have to sort of figure out. Kaiser Omnic says, I agree. That's why I prefer games with a smaller number of meaningful choices compared to games with a lot of choices that might never impact the story. One of the things that I do as a storyteller is that I will often tell my players about things that I don't intend to touch upon. If I was playing Exalted, for instance, or if I'm running Exalted, I would tell my players, maybe I'd say like, you're never really going to encounter ghosts or spirits. You're never going to go into the wild. And if I tell them that, then it means that they're not going to start spending experience on valuable charms that help them go into the wild or see spirits or interact with ghosts. Because if I've already told them this isn't something that I'm planning on bringing in, I don't want them to feel like they've wasted a whole bunch of opportunities by buying things. Now, I could ask them to just provide a character sheet without warning them about that. And then when I see that they're like, oh yeah, no, I have tons of wild charms because I want to go into the wild, well then that player has told me through their character sheet, this is what I'd like to see in the story, and then I might change my plans based on that to make sure that I can accommodate that player. But I will sometimes limit player choices in that way if I'm like, look, this is just not going to happen. And it's something to figure out. Omnic goes on to say, good practice. Some DMs seem to enjoy the gotcha aspect of negating a character's focus. Everything that you do in a game should be about enjoying the game. Now, sometimes that's creating failure. Sometimes the best moments in games involve failure and a character coming back from failure or even falling to failure. Remember that not all great role-playing stories involve everybody winning, all the PCs winning all the time. Sometimes it can be really compelling. A TPK can sometimes be the most compelling thing that can happen in a game. But I don't believe that it's wise for you as a DM or storyteller to look at somebody's sheet, look to see where they're weak, deliberately spring that on them. Because I've seen people describe that as, I wanted to teach my players a lesson about min-maxing. Or if they're going to min-max, then I want to make sure that they understand the consequences of those actions. Well, thing is, if you didn't want them to min-max in the first place, then you should have told them so, and you should have dissuaded them from doing that, as opposed to punishing them through the gameplay itself. I understand that the carrot and stick methods are honestly used methods a lot of the time when it comes to games. Basically, you offer a carrot when players do something that you like, give them a treat so that they'll continue to do that thing, and you'll hit them with a stick when they do something that they don't like so that they stop doing that. But I think that punishing min-maxers in that way doesn't always work, because instead a player might feel like they're just like, well, I suck at this, so now I hate the game. Especially because players who min-max oftentimes are players who derive their enjoyment from games by winning. And they're not there necessarily for the great story. They're there for the thrill of victory. They still like the story. They still want a story to be around there. It's why a lot of video games have stories. Even though the point is to beat the game, you want to see what happens next in the story, and you want to feel like you were a part of that story. So I'm not saying that min-maxers don't care about that, but oftentimes if you are min-maxing, what you're trying to do is you're trying to exercise your dominance over the game. So that helps. Avatar of Cain says, ST's given the power dynamic going, teach people a lesson is always a bit yeesh, even if it's well-intentioned. Yeah, it's not great. The teaching somebody a lesson is something that we do all the time. Everybody does it. It's part of social engineering. If somebody does something for you that you like, you thank them for it because you want them to know that you appreciate it so that they'll do it again, or that they'll think about doing it again at some point. Your roommate does the dishes and you vacuum the living room out of appreciation. Well, the roommate thinks, hey, if I do the dishes, then I don't have to vacuum the living room. And you think, hey, if I vacuum the living room, I don't have to do the dishes. That is still rewarding somebody for their behavior. It is still teaching. We teach and we learn all the time. But if the point is to be vindictive, that's where I start getting frustrated. And that's where I avoid it. And as Kaiser said, it's a red flag. So I avoid it entirely. It's not something that I would want to see happen. But, and here's the problem. You'll run into min-maxers who insist they're not min-maxers. And that's where you start running into, in my experience, some of the biggest problems short of twinking. We'll get to twinking, but right now we're still focusing on min-maxers. Min-maxers being people who are trying to power game their way by taking advantage of mechanics, but they're claiming they're not. Well, here's the problem when it comes to that sort of thing. It means that it's difficult to relate to that player. It's difficult to get them to understand why you have reservations or why you're making choices that they may not appreciate. And the other thing that you have to remember is that when you min-max, if you only ever give them the max and you never give them the min, then essentially what you've said is, I don't care about character creation. And that's an issue too. If, for instance, so one of the things that you'll find in a lot of storyteller system games are merits and flaws. And we'll ignore merits for now. We'll focus on flaws. But flaws are basically things that happen to my character or things that my character have as innate attributes that are disadvantageous. But in exchange, I get more points so that I can buy other things at character creation, or I can increase stats higher than they would be. And if somebody says, well, I've taken 7 points worth of flaws so that I can have a character build that I'm really proud of with a lot of combat ability or a lot of social ability or a lot of puzzle solving ability, but then those 7 points of flaws never show up in game, then what you did is you said, hey, you, unlike every other player at the table, I gave you 7 extra points to spend. Because the flaws never show up, so those points basically were free. And that meant that you got to start with an advantage, which the other players did not, because they're not abusing the system. Something that you'll often find is people taking flaws. Well, now we're veering into Munchkin territory, so we'll go back to that. But if you have a player who insists they're not min-maxing when they are, who insists they're not power gaming, or who are like, no, I have role-playing reasons for making the choices that I've made, but you suspect that really what they're going for is, I want to have, I'm trying to take advantage of mechanics, and I'm retroactively making excuses for those mechanics through role-playing decisions. The issue then becomes that it's very difficult to talk to somebody eye to eye on that situation, because they can defend every action they've taken. I'm doing this because it's appropriate for my character, when what they're actually doing is, I'm doing this because I desperately want to win the game. And that's not wrong, but it's definitely hard to deal with from a storyteller perspective. And in the past, and even recently, because I do deal with players or games, I've given some advice for some games recently where this has come up. And because for some reason that's who I am for some people at work. Anyway, the issue then becomes, how do you deal with that in a genuine way? Because it's hard to argue against, this is what I want for my character, when in reality they're going for something else. And in that case, you can either ignore it, take a deep breath, and just accept that that's what's happening and move on, or you have to address it directly. And neither of these options are very useful. So it is something to keep in mind. It is something to hold on to. One of the things that I will say about min-maxing as well, just before we get on to munchkinning, is, and I'll also go back to chat, in point-by-system games, one of the things to remember is that without role-playing, you have not accomplished anything. How do I put it? Okay, no, I think I put it in the correct way. Let's say that what you want, we're going to go to the cooking analogy as well. We're going to go back to that. Let's say that what you want to do is you want to have a character who is the best cook, the best chef in the land. And let's say that in order to be the best chef, you have to buy up the cooking skill, which in many storyteller games would be a hobby skill, basically a custom skill that you define. And let's say that you would have to buy, I don't know, if you're a chef, let's say that it's going to be wits. Why not? So if you have a pool, if you collect your wits and your cooking and you have a pool of 10, then essentially at that point, with the exception of like various individual skills, whether they're like cantrips and changeling or mage spheres, werewolf gifts, vampire disciplines, or whatever, if you have 10 in that skill, then you are the best in the world. And that's fine. But the thing that's sometimes difficult to get players to understand is that it is possible at character creation to make a character who has wits 5 and cooking 5. So they have the 10. There it is. It's right there in front of you. 10. They start the game that way. And they're like, look at me, I am the best chef. And you're like, yep, you're definitely the best chef. The problem is that all you did, quite literally, all you did as a player was you decided to assign the points there instead of somewhere else. You made the choice to min-max. And that isn't actually that fulfilling. In much the same way, as a storyteller, I could create a character with a wits cooking of 11 if I wanted to, arbitrarily, because I decide it to be so. And I'll see players be like, but that's not fair. And I'm like, it's exactly the same amount of fair. Because all I said was, these are how I'm distributing my points. That's exactly what you did. It doesn't take anything special to make that cooking character right off the bat. And in fact, it doesn't even really, if we're being very honest with ourselves, it doesn't even really take any skill to get there after playing 100 sessions. Because then that's what you've decided to spend your experience on. Eventually, you'll get to that point and you'll be able to buy up to that thing, so long as your character survives. It doesn't take all that much skill. What is interesting is, what are you doing with those points? Or what are you doing on your journey to get those points? Because being a 10 as a chef, fine, that's great. But what are you doing with it? And how are you making that interesting for your story? How are you making that fascinating for everyone around you? How are you having that affect all the other aspects of your character? And the sacrifices that you've made to be the best chef, how does that affect your character too? Are you introverted and self-focused to the point where you don't like interacting with anybody because all you've ever done is spent time in a kitchen? Is it that you've ignored the rest of your studies? So while you were supposed to become the prime minister of the United Kingdom, you ended up being a chef? So you've disappointed your parents who are lifelong politicians, and you never really learned politics the way that you were supposed to because you kept sneaking cookbooks in front of your political theory textbooks. So now your political knowledge is abysmal, even though everyone expects you to be a great prime minister. Like, where is the difference? Where's the awesomeness of that? Because if it's genuinely just, I just want to have a high pool, well, that might make you feel good initially, but something's going to disappoint you in the end. The other characters who are around you will not look at you the same way that you look at yourself. Sure, they may acknowledge, oh yes, this person is an excellent chef, but they won't give a fuck. You've always been an excellent chef. Since the moment that you walked in, you were an excellent chef. They didn't see any of the struggle that you went through to become an excellent chef. And if it doesn't make any impact in the story or your character, they won't focus on it. And ultimately, it's going to feel hollow for you unless the only thing that you care about is, anytime there's a cooking competition, I want to fucking win. And then, if that's the case, what happens when the dice fail you? Because despite the fact that you may have the highest pool in the world, you may fail. Plus, just because you have the highest dice pool that's possible doesn't mean that a storyteller character isn't going to come along who is equally as strong as you are. I think a lot of players forget that storyteller characters are allowed to be strong. That just because you made it to 10 or just because you found a loophole in the game doesn't mean that everyone else can't use those loopholes too. And so sometimes what I've done, and sometimes this works out really well. Recently, it's worked out very well with specific examples, more than one actually that I can bring up, where you ask the player, are you going to be okay if you lose? Like, sure, you have basically maxed out your ability in this particular area. How are you going to feel if you lose? And if the player responds with, well, I shouldn't lose because I'm the best, then you've got a problem. And if the player's like, oh no, I would really like the idea of losing because then it would humble my character, or I'd gain a rival, or I would really like to see what would happen to somebody who has never had to work for anything and then all of a sudden finds themselves unable to step up. Then you have something there, because then not only are you kind of getting some reassurance that the player wants to play, but now you've also given the player some ideas of what they might be able to do if that situation comes up in the future, right? The situation ends up being that. So Kaiser Omnic says, min-maxers have to accept the possibility of failure. It's a gambling playstyle. it's a gambling playstyle, but min-maxers have to accept that even the skill that they've maxed out might fail. It's kind of like in XCOM. Well, it's not a great analogy. I'm going to finish it, but it's not great. In the game XCOM, they often show you what your percentage chance is of making a shot, and you'll see that the percentage chance is 99%, and they'll click the button, and then they miss. And the player's like, what the fuck? I had a 99% chance of making that shot. This game's bullshit, when you always had a chance of failure. A 1 in 100 chance. You don't notice the 99 times that you make that shot. You assume that 99% is basically 100, so you'll always win. But that 1% is always lurking there. And if you've maxed out your character, just because you've maxed out your character doesn't mean that you're going to win. Having the highest pool does not guarantee success. Some of it is strategy, some of it is tactics, and some of it's pure dumb luck. So that's something to also keep in mind as well. Weirdness, I'm going to put this up on screen because it's the best comment that I've seen in a long time. Cooking Mama has been cursed to help fix everyone's mistakes for her hubris in seeking godhood. She plans her revenge in the shadows of the on-fire food. Being somebody who used to be a big fan of Cooking Mama, I love this. That 1% also has a way of sneaking in when you need to not fail. Absolutely, Requiem, for sure. So the thing is, when you talk to the player and you introduce these sorts of ideas of failure and what would happen if you fail, then that can really help. But in the end, I also have a message from me to you, everyone out there who has ever min-maxed. I see what you're doing. I see what you're doing. And the reason why I'm telling you this is mostly because it's mostly because I don't want you to think that you're special. I want you to recognize that when I've got players coming in, I try to make sure that I know what you are interested in doing, and I try my best to be able to give you what you are looking for in a game. But if I see that you're searching for loopholes, or you're searching for ways to min-max at character creation, post-character creation, whatever, you're not fooling me. I can tell that you are putting a lot of stock into those dice. If I looked at, like, I can point to Changeling the Streaming. I had characters who were very good at certain things right away, but the acknowledgement was that the story wasn't about how good they were with those skills. It was about what they lacked. Braum was always good at combat, but his story wasn't about how good he was at combat. It was about how he couldn't remember his life as a dashing knight. And then eventually he managed to get to the point where he got even better at combat. But it was through long, arduous journeys and the idea that his character had to spend a lot of time figuring out who he was first before he was ready to get to the point where he would become an even better fighter than he was. And it was all character-based. And that, I wasn't like, oh, Scott's min-maxing on me. That was, yes, this is a natural progression based on the idea that your character's also accomplished many great deeds. It only makes sense that this character would start becoming better at combat. Braum still died a lot. Yep, Braum definitely died a lot. Because Scott also was making choices for Braum that he knew were not necessarily tactically superior. But I've also seen players be like, yeah, I want to buy my 5th dot of cooking. And I'll say, okay, why do you believe that you need a 5th dot in cooking? And they'll have answers, and yet I know that the reason why is because you want to have the 5th dot. So just understand that I see you and I know what you're doing. And I'd rather that you tell me, I just really would like to have this big pool. Because then I'll get a better impression of what you're looking for in the game. And there doesn't necessarily have to be shame in that. You don't have to be ashamed of, like, I want to do this. But what I will get frustrated with is if you insist that it's something else. Oh, no. I want to have a 5 in cooking because my character has been spending all of their time. Hey, thanks for the follow. Zero bands, whichever bands. Yeah, first session was also because Scott didn't know some of the intricacies of Changeling because he didn't realize he couldn't soak bullets. the min-maxing by accident is completely fine. And also min-maxing on purpose can be fine. Like that is something that I said at the very beginning of the stream. I'll take this opportunity to repeat myself because now we're halfway through. If you realize that you're a min-maxer, or if you know that you're a min-maxer all along, I am not telling you that you're doing something wrong. And I'm definitely not saying that you're a bad role player. I'm saying that you're a specific kind of role player, and that there are certain unique challenges and certain unique benefits that you bring to a table. But one of the things that I will say in the end is, if you think that you're super cool because you're throwing around more dice than everyone else at the table, you're wrong. Any one of them could have made the same decisions that you did in order to have that massive dice pool. It is not an expression of skill to pick up a ton of dice. The expression of skill is what you're going to do with those dice. What are you going to do? Either through the tactics that you choose to employ in order to make sure that your character can leverage those dice properly, or about the stories that you create around those dice. That's where skill comes in. That's where your own expression and your own will comes in. That's the interesting part. That's what I want to see. So, but I did so many sleight of hand exercises to play this character, right? But that also gets into like cheating. Like, so you rolled 15 dice when you're only supposed to roll 10. Like, do you feel better about yourself in some ways? And of course, the answer for a lot of them is yes. People cheat because they like to win and they get that rush out of winning, and they don't care necessarily about doing it so in an honorable way. So if you're min-maxing, admit it to yourself, but also admit that you don't become cool because you min-max. You become cool because of what you've done by min-maxing. And I'm hoping that people realize that you become cool by embracing the min and the max. And if you are a player who really enjoys creating builds and optimizing builds, it's okay to let people know. And it's okay to just admit that that's what you want to do. But I will also remind you that just because you do that doesn't mean that you're going to actually make anyone's experience better. Remember, it's about what you do with your skills, not having the skills on your sheet in the first place. I can pick up a piece of paper and I can write whatever the heck I want on a character sheet. I can spill an ink well and just fill every single dot if I wanted to. As a storyteller, I'm even able to do so within the boundaries of the rules. But that doesn't make it an interesting character or a compelling one. And if your game involves more than just the war game aspect of it, that's something to consider. It's something to think about, because in the end, why do you want these stats? If the answer is because I want my character to be able to flaunt these stats, you may be disappointed when no one around you cares. I just rolled 10 successes on 7 dice. I don't care what you say, John, I feel cool. So then that comes into another thing. It does feel good to pick up a whole ton of dice and to get a lot of successes. That is a rush. It is a dopamine rush. Like, go for it. It's going to make you feel good. And that's okay too, which is why we deserve to have specialties. It's why we deserve to have big dice pools. But my point is, it's what you do with those dice that's going to affect the other people at the table, not just you. And remember that gaming should be something that's fun for everybody, not just you. And you should be focused on making sure that everyone at the table is having a good time, not just you. And that's where min-maxing can start interfering with a game. Because if you start focusing too much on making sure that you are the one who gets to roll all the dice and no one else, then you're focused on yourself. We can also move on to twinking. So twinking is the deliberate manipulation of the game. Here, actually, first we'll go on to Avatar of Kane's comment before we get into Munchkining. Dice Rush is a pretty fun rush, but I think I get what you mean in terms of min-maxing and making those min rolls / botches an equal rush as the player. I don't necessarily know if they have to be an equal rush. They're different rushes. Botching when you really, really, really wanted to succeed is naturally, you're going to have this moment of disappointment, and that's that's actually important, because if you never felt disappointment at a failure or a botch, then it means that the successes eventually stop mattering. But you should be excited in a different way to find out what's going to happen next because your character failed. What I'm trying to say specifically is that Dice Rush is fun, but you need to make sure that it's fun for everyone. And that is, in the end, based on what are you doing with those dice? What do you do with the result of those dice? And how do you contribute overall to the game with those things? So Munchkinning, Power Gaming, Twinking, not Power Gaming. Power Gaming is different on this channel, it's depending on how we define it. But Twinking specifically, this is when somebody is really pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable in order to come out on top. These are people who are doing things that actually degrade experiences for other people. And how is this possible? So I will give you an example. Once again, drawing back from the storyteller system versions of games, flaws often are things that you apply to your character in order to gain a bonus of character creation, where in a lot of games, character creation freebie points are more valuable because things have a set cost as opposed to an increasing cost. I try and seduce the dragon. So as an example, oftentimes the increasing an attribute, or say your willpower or your resource, whether that's rage, your vampire doesn't actually specifically have one because they have humanity and they have willpower, but they don't, and blood is something that they don't necessarily connect one of those things. But like generation, for instance, you can't buy generation easily once you go into games, so you got to spend freebie points on it. Your attributes cost a flat rate, but once you're in game, you have to spend a number of experience based on how much you already have, so it becomes more expensive to get those highest numbers. So freebie points are very valuable, and people will take flaws in order to get those freebie points. Well, Munchkins take those flaws in one of two ways. Either they'll take the flaws and they'll understand that they will never come up in game, or they'll minimize their effect on the game as much as possible, essentially stealing those freebie points. Or they're going to take flaws that are just going to make the game a pain in the ass for everyone else. Not in a way that emphasizes role-playing or story or fun, but in a way that drags everyone else around. Something like, oh yeah, I have a flaw that's going to be an addiction. I have an addiction. Very commonly, I have an addiction to caffeine. Oftentimes they'll say this because caffeine is something that pretty much 90% of adults in Western nations, at least, have an addiction to caffeine, either through coffee or other foods. And they'll say like, well, yeah, no, I have to drink a lot of coffee. Well, a lot of coffee is pretty easy to get, so you'll almost never have to worry about suffering the disadvantage of that. But then when you do, all you're doing is just being obnoxious about the fact that like, oh, well, I mean, come on, my character would have brought coffee with him. He carries a thermos with him. He carries a bag of ground beans everywhere he goes, you know, in an attempt to basically get out of having to serve their flaw. Or they'll take a flaw like, oh yeah, well, I have a 5-point enemy. I have a 5-point enemy, and it's going to make everyone's life a living hell, except that I'm the only one who gets to beat on the enemy because it's my enemy. I want to be the one to take him down. Other people, no, they can stay out of it. In which case, this person basically bought 5 freebie points to say, I want to have an element of the game that only involves me and not involves anyone else. So there's that. You could have somebody who's like, I'm going to take a flaw, and I fully understand that I'm taking a flaw, and then get surprised when that flaw comes up in game. And even though that's not something that they can do anything about, then they're just like, well, what the hell? Like, I didn't realize that you were actually going to make me suffer for taking a flaw that I took so that I could min-max my stats out. You know, like that's another thing that will come up. Munchkins will often insist that certain magical materials get assigned to them because it's important for their build, and then complain or sulk or pout if they don't get what they want. They'll badger storytellers to give them the magic weapons that they need to complete the builds that they've made. You'll find this in D&D a lot, being like, well, I need a fire-based weapon because all my feats are based around having a weapon that has fire attached to it. So if you don't give me a fire weapon, my build is useless. So give me a fire weapon. And the DM might be like, I don't want to give you a fire weapon. It's not part of my plan. It's not part of what I want. And the person's like, well, then my build is fucked and you fucked my whole game and I hate you and I'm quitting because I don't get to finish my build, because now my build is only somewhat optimal as opposed to completely maxed out optimal. These are munchkins. And munchkinning is definitely more of an issue. This is behavior that you kind of have to nip in the bud, but sometimes it's hard because it doesn't always crop up right away. And you also have to realize that sometimes, hey, Craft01, thanks for the follow. Sometimes, I saw the title and worried about you I was going to talk about, but thus far I'm spitting facts. Min-maxing is something that can absolutely be fun, but it's also something that can be absolutely destroying for either the storyteller or DM or GM, or even everyone at the table. And that's kind of what I wanted to make sure that we discuss today. The idea that it's okay to want to min-max. It's okay to min-max to a certain degree, but you have to make sure that you're recognizant of the effect that you're having on the game. So if you are munchkinning, if you're specifically making choices that make other people's lives miserable, or if you are hyper focused on making sure that where you are maxing your character out is the only thing that matters in the game, you need to recognize that behavior and understand that what you're doing is you're degrading everyone else's good time. This is also something that happens if you're min-maxing in a game where those skills are specifically not called for. Just the idea, like, for instance, if you're playing a political intrigue game, very much like Kings and Queens and, very Game of Thrones, and you're like, okay, well, I've created a character and all this character is good at is assassination. That's all I do, is I stab people in the back. That's what I want to do with the rest of my character. My character's good at sneaking up and stabbing people in the back. Well, the problem is that you get in that situation of every problem looks like a nail when you're holding a hammer. If you're playing a game of political intrigue, and meanwhile you have one character who's like, I've maxed out my ability to assassinate, and all I want to do is assassinate, well, then that messes up the game, because people are dying when you want them to be part of the political intrigue. And you've drastically shifted the focus and the feel of the game as a result. This is an unfortunate thing that you have to realize ends up being a problem for everyone else. And because you have hyper-focused your character, it's not easy for you to say, well, okay, well, I'm an assassin, but I can play the political intrigue game too. Well, no, you can't. You've sunk all your points in being able to sneak around and stab people. You're no good at talking to anybody. And because you don't want to roll dice that makes you less likely to succeed, you're going to fall back on your ability to assassinate. So you're actually doing yourself a disservice, but otherwise you're deliberately messing up the rest of the game. Requiem Law says, on the topic of merits and flaws, I've honestly been in the habit of only using the bonus points from flaws to only buy merits. For me, it makes for a more interesting character. I can't say it would make it a table rule, but I find it interesting. I've seen that as a house rule a lot. I think part of the problem is that there are merits and flaws in those games that are absolutely busted. A lot of them are absolutely busted, and that's why I often just say you can't take any of either. It's easier than saying, like, well, out of the 100 choices you have, here are the 20 that are okay. Sometimes I just say no. Isn't that rules is written? No, Avatar of Cain, it's not. In games that have a merit and flaw system in the storyteller system, they give you freebie points. You're allowed to purchase merits with freebie points without taking requisite flaws, and you're allowed to take flaws to gain freebie points without taking any requisite merits. A lot of people do that. Now, the rules as written will often state that you can take a maximum of 7 points of flaws. That's where you max out and you can't take any more. They sometimes, I think 1 or 2 of the books may say at some points in some editions that you can only take a maximum of 7 points of merits, but most of them you can take as many merits as you can based on 15 freebie points plus a maximum of 7 freebie points from your flaws. But otherwise you do not have to equalize them at all. You don't have to. And a lot of the merits are dumb. They're things like, yeah, well, for computer rolls, you have a -2 to all your computer roll difficulties. Knowing that a -2 difficulty to all rolls is the equivalent, roughly, of 4 dice. 4 dice added to all of your computer rolls for a merit that costs the same amount as buying 1 dot at character creation of computers. So, like, stupid. Just completely stupid. Exalted is a bit different because Exalted, sometimes, depending on the edition, merits are basically your backgrounds. So that's a different thing. Merits are a very specific thing, and flaws tend to not give you bonus points at character creation. They give you experience if the flaw inconveniences you. So Craft01 points out, I prefer rule sets that give you a benefit when your flaw affects you. The Chronicles of Darkness, otherwise known as the New World of Darkness, they do this at this point, where if your flaw basically gives you a condition and then you clear that condition, then you get a beat, and a beat is basically experience. New Exalted basically says if something has inconvenienced you in your party, and you have to overcome it, then you can get a bonus experience point, but you don't get any benefit right away from having it. And that's to encourage the idea that your flaw actually has to be a flaw and they have to do stuff. I appreciate this. You kind of have to have players who are not greedy about this, because it can get real annoying if someone's like, oh, well, I'm hard of hearing, so this conversation is difficult for me. And you're like, every conversation is difficult for you in this game because you never bothered to learn sign language or lip reading or whatever. So no, you can't keep just getting bonus points because you exist in a world where it's difficult for you to hear. That is an issue that we kind of run into. And that's not to say that, no, it does provide some challenges for characters if, for instance, they can't hear or they can't see or they can't walk properly, or they have a phobia or whatever. Obviously, those things are role-playing opportunities, but it gets frustrating when you're basically just bringing them up for the sole purpose of getting that sweet, sweet experience. I'll also say that at this point in my gaming career, I absolutely insist on XP parity. I believe that it's okay for players to earn experience for the table. So if you want to have something like, hey, so Jane at your table did a really good job of role-playing somebody who has a phobia today. So that's an experience for everyone at the table to get. I think that's great. But I'm now past the point where I'm like, Jane gets an extra experience over you other schlubs at the table because Jane had her flaw come into play, and that made me happy as a storyteller, so she gets a bonus and the rest of you don't. It's why I don't do noms anymore. It's why for a long time I did play the game, which was basically, the audience would vote on what was the coolest moment in the game, which player had the coolest moment, and that player would get 1 additional experience. And then I realized that ultimately it just basically meant that either players are going to compete amongst themselves to try to outdo each other, which was not the environment that I wanted to put in. I wanted people to advance other players' stories, to support other players' great spotlight moments, which my players were already doing. And it also meant that oftentimes the person who got rewarded was not the person I believe deserved it, because people tend to reward things that are loud or bombastic instead of quiet moments, which are really, really cool. So I ditched those. So in terms of flaws, yeah, I like rule sets that gives you the benefit when the flaw affects you, but I also prefer when the when that benefit extends to the entire table. So these days, that's what happens for me, and that's what I would end up house ruling for any system at this point, would be that bonus experience goes into a pool, and once you've accumulated enough bonus experience for everyone at the table to equally divide it, that's when it gets released. So if, say, 2 bonus experience was earned by 1 player and you have 4 players at the table, then that just goes into a pool and nobody gets it. And then when 2 more bonus experience is earned, either by 1 player or several, well, now you have 4, everybody gets 1 bonus experience. You've all earned it because you all supported each other in doing that. Because also remember, a player who often gets a role-playing nomination, sometimes it's because they're genuinely just like more suited to doing things like performing, ad-libbing, improvisation, cracking jokes, and that these are skills. I'm a trained professional actor. It's easier for me to be able to come up with cool speeches off the top of my head than it would be for somebody who, for instance, might be a complete whiz at, I don't know, everything else in the world, but isn't necessarily suited for performance. But that doesn't mean that they should suffer because I happen to have that skill set. Instead, if that player, gives me the opportunity to have these moments, then that player should deserve to be rewarded. He went off on a tangent, folks. It happens. At any rate, the tangents for days. I'll also point this out, and I know that there are going to be people who will feel called out about this, whether or not they've directly gamed with me, but I am going to tell you this, not because I want you to feel bad, but because I want you to appreciate this. I was talking earlier about how I notice when someone's min-maxing. I notice when somebody is trying to break a game, not in a malicious way, but basically I just want you to know that sometimes in my head, the impression that I get, if you are somebody who is deliberately trying to become the best at accumulating a big pool of dice, is that oftentimes I will think, perhaps I'm not the storyteller for you. And it is something to consider, because I feel like I'm going to let you down, because I will not just grant you victory all the time. Or if I do, if I'm granting you victory all the time, like literally all the time, and I don't ever cause any struggle for you, it's because I've given up on you. And that's embarrassing for me to admit. Like, that's basically me saying that, yeah, like I have my own issues, and I totally do. I'm not perfect, but there will be moments where I'll just be like, fine, whatever, win, like you kill the stone giant. Congratulations. Hooray. Yeah, whatever. I'm not even going to bother trying to beat you, because I know that at a certain point, all you really want is to roll your dice and say, like, you did it. You got it. Okay. And that's not for all min-maxers, but it's definitely for people who I'm just like, you're just trying to get big dice pools. At which point, fine, I'll give you your win, but I'm not going to care about it. And I feel a bit badly, but it's also just the way it is. Because I'm not the storyteller for you at that point. I can't drum up the interest to allow you to roll dice and win. I want the story. And I want your character to feel cool, and I want you to feel cool. But I have zero interest in saying, all right, well, I'll present you with an enemy that I know you can eviscerate, because that's the only thing that your character is good at, and it's the only thing that you ever want to do. The great characters are the ones who possibly are fantastic at combat, but then enjoy playing everything else. I'll do stuff for them. No problem. Absolutely. But if you show up to one of my games, especially a mass game like a LARP, and you're basically there to say, I have totally maxed out and optimized my character in all ways, shapes, and forms. I am a living god at this thing, then I just don't care about giving you that thing. I just don't, because all you want to do is win. And you've made it so that if I have to beat you, I have to cheat, or I have to start looking for loopholes. And I just am not that interested in it. So, okay, I'll give you your victory, but just know that I don't care. I'm not having fun. And that's a problem, because I should be using my word hole. I should be going up to a player and saying, knock it off. Like, I see what you're doing. It's okay. Like, honestly, in much the same way that, like, tacticians, I sometimes have difficulty with, because I don't want to sit there for 2 hours while you make a plan. Especially because I know that your plan, if I wanted to at any point, I can make your plan useless, because I'm the storyteller and I can make whatever changes I want. I appreciate tacticians. I think that they, like, I will play with them, but I do definitely have a certain point where I have to be like, I just don't want to sit here and watch you go over the plan, like, for the 5th time. I don't want to create detailed battle maps for you for every encounter that's going to happen. Like, that just doesn't interest me. And in the same way, it doesn't interest me to serve a completely munchkined out character. I just don't. I will say that I will privately mock you in my head if I think that you're a min-maxer, but more of in an endearing way. Like, oh, like, this person is buying his, like, 15th dot in a certain thing. And, like, there's a part of me that's going to be like, okay, like, whoop-de-doo. But then again, like, I do plenty of things that are stupid. And there's plenty of reasons why I'll look at a character and be like, oh, it's this trope. Hey, Dark293. Fantastic. I'm really glad to hear that. Thanks so much for coming in and saying that. I really do appreciate when people come in and mention that. Wanted to let you know the White Wolf games were a huge hit with my group. Definitely having the results I was hoping to. That's great. Anytime somebody finds the game that they want to play, it's fantastic to me. But yeah, so there's going to be a little bit of snickering if I see that somebody is obviously min-maxing. But at the same time, if it makes you happy, fucking go for it. Just do it. Do what makes you happy in the game. Just remember that you want to make everyone else happy too. I realize I've been going on this topic for a bit. Are there questions or comments that people want to throw out about min-maxing or about anything in role-playing in general? Is there anything that I've said that you disagree with? Because that's actually where it gets interesting, and I'm definitely down to hear about ways in which you may disagree with what I've just said. I'll remind you, I am one person. It is, everything I say is strictly opinion at this point, and you definitely do not have to agree with what I'm throwing out there. I am not a definitive source of information. I have a lot of experience, but it's the experience of one person, and one person of my particular, situation. I mostly run games. I've played in a few. My preference for games tend towards point-by system games and storyteller system games. So, not all of this will apply to hardcore Pathfinder players and the like. So, Craft01 has a suggestion. You should talk about a mixed group. What to do when there's one min-maxer and 4 role players. How to ensure the min-maxer doesn't make the others obsolete. Yeah, I skimmed over that part earlier, but I didn't really get into it. So yeah, let's get into it here. The issue that you're going to find with a min-maxer is that they often throw the math of the game off. A lot of games are balanced around the idea that every player should be able to survive an encounter. And by survive an encounter, I don't necessarily just mean combat. Survive an encounter means, like, if it's a social situation, it's assumed that should everyone try their best, the story will end up fun for everybody. But that, like, success means that one person might be doing all the talking, but everyone else didn't absolutely destroy things by putting their foot in their mouth or just, like, shouting racial slurs everywhere. If it's for solving a puzzle, even if it's one person doing most of the solving, the other characters are surviving by not, like, walking up and hitting a puzzle with an axe. And in combat's kind of like the specific area where where it's a bit tricky, is if an enemy comes at you and is a challenge for one person in the group, if everyone else in the group is vastly underpowered compared to that character, then it's possible that enemy can walk up and just obliterate the rest of the people in the room. And that's not necessarily the kind of game that you want to run. It feels especially bad if, for instance, you have somebody who's like, yeah, I am somebody who deals with combat on a regular basis. I am somebody who would consider themselves a soldier. I have trained for combat. I am considered lethal. I have a pool of 6 out of 10, which is actually really high. That means that you're above average, and that you can beat 99% of the planet in your chosen field just by having a pool of 6. Well, a pool of 6 is definitely good. But then if you have somebody else who comes along and they say, well, I have a pool of 15 because I was blessed by a wizard when I was young, and I have a weapon that gives me an extra 3 dice because I'm just that fucking awesome. And I sold my children to a witch to be eaten, and she gave me magic boots that make sure that I always step properly. So now I have a pool of 15. Well, it's going to make that first player who's like, I'm a soldier and I'm struggling to be the best, but I also want to be, a good person, and I have other hobbies, and I dabble in computer science here and there. But my main thing is combat. And then this other person's like, yeah, my main thing is combat, but I really tricked my shit out. Well, it sucks because that first person can't do much of anything in combat compared to this other person, depending on how you make things work. So one of the things that you could do is you could provide with multiple enemies, and you could be like, there's the bad guy, the big bad, and the big bad has a bunch of minions. So the minions make sure that the other people go off and deal with the minions, and then the combat tricked out character will face off against the big bad. You could do that, but that might wear thin after a little bit. You could make sure that combat isn't the only thing that happens in a session, so that everybody has the time to shine, but that when combat does happen, it's resolved in a way that is satisfactory to the min-maxer, but that it doesn't take too much time for everyone else. That is an idea. And you can also have situations where you specifically create a situation whereby a character you can remind how that character can support. In a lot of first-person shooters, for instance, which are class-based, you're going to have some classes that are support classes. They're never going to have the most kills. They're not going to rack up the damage, but they're indispensable for a team because they tank a lot of damage from other people, or they heal teammates. And reminding players that there are ways for you to participate in these games and in these combats or these intrigues or whatever, where you can support the person who has to shoulder the heavy lifting, that can honestly make sure that then people feel like at least they've got something to do, right? Sure, you might not be able to handle going one-on-one versus somebody with a sword, but you can absolutely buff the person who can. That's a way to participate. That's a way to help. Engineer or medic in TF2 is good examples of this. Absolutely dark, for sure. The concept of support for some players is actually what they want. I loved playing medic in TF2, partially because I was good at it. And there is skill involved in being a good support player. But sometimes I would play with somebody who was quite literally pro level at gaming, to the point where now he works in game design. He's a level designer now. But the reason why he's such a great level designer is because he understands how pros think. And I mean, he never went pro. He was too busy with his other jobs. But like, I don't mean like, oh, he was good at video games. I mean, he was scouted. He was legitimately requested to try out for professional teams. And I loved supporting him because he appreciated my support. I could never claim to be a pro level support, but I was decent. And when we were just playing around for fun, supporting him felt really good because I felt like not only could I experience victory, but I could share the victory with him. And despite the fact that, yes, he was doing a lot of the heavy lifting in those situations, I was absolutely a part of why he was so successful. So that helps in a lot of ways to get people feeling better about the game that they're playing. And you can have that with min-maxers as well. But one thing that you can do is you can just talk to somebody and say like, I'm going to have to put some caps on this if you need to. If you're discovering that somebody is min-maxing too hard. But remember that min-maxing and loophole searching are two different things. Somebody who is bending the rules in order to gain an advantage is different than somebody who's just trying to play within the rules as best they can. Somebody who's trying to take advantage of game design, which is not balanced, is different than min-maxing in a lot of ways. It's something that I noticed in the 24/7 Changeling game that I help run, is that there are characters out there who naturally gravitated towards the most overpowered magics in the game. And it's not because they were trying to min-max, it's because they had no experience with Changeling. And so when they were looking at least this is what I suspect. So like while they were looking at all the options that they had for magic, they were like, oh, that looks good. And they picked it because they could recognize that it was very strong and what they could do with it was very strong. And that's not that they were being min-maxy in a way that was degenerate, but it was min-maxy in a way that they were like, yeah, well, of course I'm going to pick this. Look how powerful it is. This makes a lot of sense. I don't know the rest of the game, so I'll default to trying to take advantage of mechanics instead. And it has caused me to have to evaluate things because also there's a difference between the story-based character the story-based player who took an art because they're like, oh yeah, I can use this spell in this way and it would be interesting, to the player who takes this art because they're like, yeah, I can totally break the game with this. I can become very, very powerful with this. And the game was probably written with the first person in mind and not the second. And I've realized that there are some arts, for instance, in Changeling 20th edition, which are completely fucking broken. And there are some that as soon as you start thinking about how you can use it creatively, they're completely broken. And some of them are broken because they're not worded correctly. They're vague in their templating. So instead of it being like, oh yeah, this art is designed to be a minor inconvenience if you cast it on someone looked at it and was like, oh yeah, but I could use this to make somebody's life a living hell for months. That's not really what it's for, but you could do it that way, and well, now you're stuck. You're stuck because that's what it says in the book. So you have to nerf things, and nerfing things feels really bad because you're basically offering toys to children and then saying, this toy is too fun, I have to take it away from you. Especially because this toy is making every other child feel terrible. So you run into that, and that is annoying. Requiem Lost says, in my experience, when the fight is the min-max versus the big bad and the other character versus the minions, those are not fun for the non-min-maxers. Yeah, we killed X number of Xers while you ripped the head off the big bad. Yeah, I was useful. So Requiem, you do have to balance the idea that the combat has to be interesting for everybody, but you also can't necessarily penalize the character who wanted to be involved in combat if everyone else didn't want to be involved in combat. Like, then it sucks, right? Like, if you're just like, well, then we're never going to have combat. If you misled that player into believing that there was going to be combat and then you never give it to them because no one else was interested in combat, and it would be lame for them to experience combat, well, then you're basically telling that guy, you don't get to be Spotlight ever. And if you're like, okay, well, then there can be combat, but there's only one big bad guy, and I can't risk this big bad guy attacking any of the other characters because they'll get squashed in one hit. Well, that's the problem. So some of it is that if you have a big bad guy and you have minions, if you make the minions interesting, remember, just because they're minions doesn't necessarily mean that they're faceless. I know minions is a game term for often like unimportant NPC, but they can still be important NPCs, just not as heavily involved in combat. Then that's something you can do. You may also be able to run a split scene where one person is fighting the big bad and everyone else is doing something like defusing a bomb or convincing the hostages that they can trust you, or trying to find that book in the library before the tower self-destructs when the big bad dies. You know, there are ways to make it so that you basically give somebody an alternative objective while you give the combat monster the big bad to fight. So, Kung Fu Finder says, again, do not write combat scenes, write action scenes. No, I think you can write combat scenes. I think that I think this is absolutely a valuable thing to keep in mind. Action scenes can involve combat, but they can also involve other things. So, you know, you give people a chance. But I definitely think that there are times where you're like, no, the point is I want somebody to have the opportunity to engage in combat. Like a duel, for instance. If there's a duel, then that would imply that you have, you know, a character facing off against another character, and they are going to fight. And that's a combat scene. And the duel can be incredible. It doesn't mean that there can't be, you know, catcalling, taunting between the two of them. The moment of trying to psych somebody out before you start the fight. Do you cheat in the duel? Do you not cheat in the duel? But that is still a combat scene. You've still written a combat scene. Combat will take place. D&D as a game implies combat. All of those rules, all of that stuff in like the monster manual and the DM's guide and all of that stuff, that's for combat. That's straight up for combat. It's okay to write combat scenes. What's not okay is to say in a combat scene, the only thing you can do is combat, if that's the kind of game that you don't want to run. So Kung Fu Fenders, you can't complain if I say, sometimes I want to write combat scenes, and you're like, why? And I then give you an answer and you're like, well, yeah, of course that. Like, then yeah, sometimes combat scenes are correct. And sometimes action scenes are correct. But I also would imply that you can write a combat scene, but if you've kind of made it known in your game that it's okay to not engage in combat, then you just also have to go with that too. How much railroading do you actually want to do? Because in some games, that's all everybody wants to do. They only want to do combat. That's all they want. They want to pick up dice and roll them. So in the early days, HP was health points or hit points. Yeah. So here's the thing. Combat is a single scene. Action scenes are a plethora of opportunities. It's a micro macro thing. Then they're not the same thing. Then you're talking about action sequences compared to combat scenes or whatever. Now we're just getting into minutia, but it's I resist. I think and this is not your fault because I don't think this is what you're trying to say, but I resist it when people are like, combat is bad or wanting to roll dice is bad, because I think that there's a stage in people's role-playing lives where they start really kind of discovering the possibility of story, and they really love story, and then they start looking down on anything that isn't story and isn't that kind of thing. But I believe that a big portion of role-playing is the gamification of role-playing. I like the rules. I could have no rules and just sit in a room with my friends and we can tell stories together. We could just act out improv scenes all day, every day. Scott and I have both done professional improv. For years, I was paid to do improv. I was not paid very much, but I was an in-house improv performer for a comedy club. I would go out on corporate gigs and do improv. I can do things without rules, but I like the rules. I think the rules are fun. And I resist the idea that just because it's not necessarily something that you're interested in at this time, that makes it somehow worse or wrong. In much the same way that for min-maxing, the idea of trying to find out the optimal situation of the mechanics, that's not wrong. Like, that's not a bad thing. What's a bad thing ends up being if you're doing it at the expense of other people, or if you're doing it ignoring the rest of the game. So, sequence and scene, Mr. Educated in Acting, what's the difference? You said, here's the thing, combat is a single scene, action scenes are a plethora of opportunities. Combat is a single scene, it doesn't have to be. A combat scene might be, okay, well, first I'm going to fight the people in front of the door, then I'm going to fight the people who are behind the door, then I'm going to fight the king who is standing behind all of those other people. You could say that those are 3 separate combat scenes, and I could say that maybe that's a combat sequence. If you say that an action scene, well, what constitutes a scene? Is a scene we're trying to escape this one particular room, so we have to take several actions to do that, but we haven't escaped the whole dungeon. Well, then how many scenes is that? So the real question is, what is a scene versus what is a sequence? And to me, a sequence is a sequence of events. It could be several scenes chained together, whereas a scene is one single thing happening. But both combat and action can take place in scenes or in sequences. But a plethora of opportunities, action scenes is a plethora of opportunities. What we're essentially saying here is when you are creating an opportunity where there could be combat, but you are letting your players have another option out, then you could call that an action scene. But then one of the opportunities could be like, no, wait, let's sit down and talk about this. And that's not very action-y at all. That's just a conversation. I don't typically like railroading players, and I want them to deal with things the way that I want. But also, sometimes I'm like, I don't care what you say. My character picks up a tree branch and hucks it right at your head, because I cannot always let players dictate what the correct solution will be. If I did that, then first of all, I'm not participating, right? All I'm basically doing is I'm pin setting. I'm setting up pins and I'm letting you knock them down. But if I always let you run up to the pins and kick them, there's no skill. And if you can always choose how you want to approach a problem, then there's less drama involved there. Whereas if I'm like, okay, well, your character isn't necessarily good at combat, but they live in a world where sometimes somebody just wants to take a crowbar to your face, well, now I'm putting them in a situation where they're not necessarily at their best, but I can create drama out of that. I can give a sense of excitement and a fear of failure, or even an excitement about what's going to happen if there's failure. And I can't do that if I'm like, well, you'll always have an ability to get out of combat, because then the player is safe and always safe. And I don't want to necessarily have my players always feel safe. Depends on the game. If it's a game where everybody just wants to play fluffy bunnies hopping around in a forest, and the most problem they ever want to have is a farmer chasing them away with a broom, then yeah, obviously it'd be weird if all of a sudden the farmer's daughter came out with a crowbar and started smashing faces in. That would be tonal dissonance, and that would suck. But most games aren't like that. Most role-playing games aren't like that. So Kung Fu Fenris says, action scenes are, in my mind, an umbrella term. Combat seems to be a very narrow type of engagement. Combat is always action. Action is not always combat. Sure, that makes sense. But like I said, sometimes I want combat to happen. So I'm going to have a combat happen. I'm going to have a combat scene. And that's all there is to it. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have that there. Fluffy Bunnies Running Away from a Farmer sounds like a great one-shot game. I mean, also the crowbars implicated in that also sounds like it could be an interesting one-shot. We didn't end up talking about one-shots, so I'm going to have to talk about it another day. The problem is that I got the suggestion for one-shots. The reality is I don't play a ton of one-shots. So I'm not sure if I'd have... Like, I definitely have stuff to say. Yeah, I could probably fill an episode with it, but, you know, I was more excited to talk about min-maxing, I guess, at this point. Hey, players, have you heard about eagles? Yeah. Anyway. And I've dropped something. Oh, that thing's never coming back. Oh, boy. What the hell is going on here? Okay, so I just found something. And I'm going to show you. And I don't want you to think less of me, but you will. Crosshair would tell you right away that he is not a bunny. So he gets out of it that way. I dropped a pen cap, so I found it. And next to the pen cap, I found this. And I had no idea how this got here until I thought about it for a second. I found an eggshell. What the hell is an eggshell doing on the floor of my office? And then I realized it's because I took the garbage, like the waste paper basket out of my office. And I dumped it. And then I threw an egg in it while I was in the kitchen because I just needed to drop it somewhere. And then I carried it back into my office, forgetting that it was in there. And I must have carelessly, I must have overturned my waste paper basket while I was holding it and put it down. And now there's an eggshell in my office. But that still means that I've had an eggshell on my floor for hours today. And I didn't realize that it was there because it was sitting underneath my computer tower. So, yeah. It's even got text written on it. Which must have been the stamp from the egg. It's very sticky. Not sticky, well, it's dry. But, I mean, all the eggshells sticking together, I guess, because, things have dried up. So, anyway. It's not like I've never eaten in this office. Sometimes I'll, sneak breakfast or lunch in here while I'm working. But why would I bring an eggshell out of a kitchen, right? That just doesn't make any sense. At least I didn't step on it. You're right. You're absolutely right. But, I realize also eating at a desk is a bad habit, but, also wanting to get out of work early is a good habit, right? Anyway. So, in conclusion, if you are min-maxing, you should not necessarily feel ashamed. You should ask yourself the following question. Am I doing this for myself and the rest of the group? Or am I just doing it for myself? If the answer is I'm just doing it for myself, then you have to ask, am I doing this in such a way that it will harm the rest of the group? If the answer is yes, don't do it. If the answer is I don't think so, you need to really sit and reflect and possibly even ask other players and your storyteller about this and figure out whether you're actually doing something that you should be or not. It is very tempting sometimes to focus on the self and be like, this is what I'm really excited about. But just because you're excited about it doesn't mean it will be the best for the game. If you are doing things and you are deliberately trying to break the game, you need to take a look at yourself and figure out why that's something that you're interested in doing. If you are doing something because you want to be better than everyone else at the table, then I would suggest that you are doing something wrong and that you need to start figuring out how to fix that. And I don't mean the best at the table at a certain something. I mean just that you will be the player who wins the most. Because then you're also leaning dangerously close to the idea of cheating is a good idea, because then at least I get to win, right? So there's that too to keep in mind. IDDQD, very much reading aloud. As long as there are people who remember that sequence of letters. The other thing to remember as you're making your character or figuring out where you want to spend your experience or the like is just because you have the dice doesn't actually make the character. The character is made by what you do with it. It's made by what your character does and how they interact with everyone else and how they change the story. You can be the best chef in all the land, but you can't expect anyone else to care unless you make it important for them to care. And if the only thing that's interesting about you is that you're a chef and nothing else, then as soon as you being a chef doesn't matter, you stop to matter. Or you stop mattering, I should say. So be careful. Remember that it takes no skill to max a character out, or very little skill, depending on the game system that you're using. Especially in point-buy games, anybody could just drop experience to go as high as you. Anybody could, at character creation, figure out the exact sequence to place dots in order to have that high a pool. That does not make you special. And making a choice that other players didn't isn't enough to justify why you're doing what you're doing. Make sure that it's interesting. And make sure that not only are you going to have fun with what the choices are that you've made, but everyone will. And remember that the choice to put dots in something is equally as valid as the choice not to put dots in something. And that if you can't revel in your victories and your defeats, in your strengths and your weaknesses, then you need to consider that maybe this isn't the correct way to go about doing this. If you don't want to have weaknesses, but you definitely want to have strengths, then it's possible for you to build a more even build where your weaknesses are less emphasized and your strengths may not hit the highest peaks. But it is generally a bad move for you to think about what are the ways in which I can minimize the suffering that I will take based on my point allocation and maximize the gain. Remember that a storyteller has several options that they can use. Sometimes it's enough to ask a player, why are you doing this? Or, knowing that you're doing this, how will you react when you fail? Either as part of your weaknesses, but just as importantly, if not more so, when you fail in an area in which your character shows strength. Get them to start thinking about why they're making the choices that they are. And if honestly the only reason is, I want to win and I hate when I lose, then it's important to remind them that loss, that failure must be a part of the game. Because if you only ever succeeded, there's no reason to play at all. Or at least there's no reason to roll the dice, because there's no chance. And when there's no chance, forget it. And finally, a reminder to all of you out there who are min-maxing, either now, in the future, or in the past. You're not fooling most people. We can recognize what you're doing. We see that you are prioritizing some things over others. And that doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong, but at least understand that we'd rather that you be honest with us as to the reasons why you're making some of the choices that you are, so that we can tell what we want to emphasize and what we don't, so that we can also try to guide you in ways to say, these are ways in which you can be compatible with the game and yet still be powerful in these areas. And the way that you have chosen may not necessarily reflect how we want the game to move forward. In storytelling, loss is a win condition? Very much. Sometimes it is. Some of the best gaming moments that I've had have been moments of failure. And I will point out that the best victories that I've had come on the backs of failures. Because a victory that's unearned doesn't feel great at all. And for min-maxers, victory is important. But make sure that it's not the only thing. Tomorrow, I believe there will be more Punch Effect. That is Elizabeth A. Neal, twitch.tv/Elizabeth A. Neal. They'll be playing Mass Effect 3 on Saturday. There's more Drew Crew and I think Doomed. On Sunday, I believe that there's Punchy Book Club. Sandman continues. And then at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, remember, we will be playing day 4 of our playthrough of The King's Dilemma, a legacy board game, which honestly, we're having a ton of fun with. So, Scooter is out. It's very possible. I'm not certain, but we'll see. You know, some of this kind of depends on some things. I know that there's a chance that Scott will not be there, in which case they probably won't play Mass Effect. They'll play something else. But I think there might be a chance that he will. We'll see. Either way, you know, if you look at our Discord, that's often the best place to find out information about our streams, either the ones on this channel or the ones on our individual channels. If you're all interested in playing with us in our Changeling the Dreaming 20th anniversary game that goes on 24/7 on a separate Discord server, join our Discord server and ask about it. And we will see what we can do about getting you an invite on there. It's been going on for quite a few months now. And right now would be definitely a very good time. We're wrapping up a storyline that has been going on for a while, which makes now a very good time to introduce a new character. So if you're at all interested, look into it, because this is the time that we're going to see some shifting. Some players are going to be retiring their characters and starting new ones. And now would be a good time to get on board. So by all means, check that out. Otherwise, thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I will take this opportunity, as I do at the end of most of these sessions. If you're experiencing an issue in your role-playing games, it's not the easiest solution. In some ways, it can be very difficult, but it's often the best solution to just use your word hole. We'll see you next time.